Sveiki atvykę į antrąją forumo Šimtmečio paralelės Lietuva ir pasaulis dalį. We will start now our second part of the conference and the forum. And in the first part, we had already touched the issues of reuse of construction material, reuse of existing buildings. So right now with this presentation, we will go even deeper in the topic of diminishing the negative impact of construction market on climate and reuse of construction materials. I am very glad to present our speaker, Michaël Ghyoot, representing the famous studio Rotor from Brussels. Since 2005, Rotor analyzes possibilities of reuse of construction materials and uses the result of their research in real projects of sustainable architecture, buildings and interiors. The topic of reuse proved to be so relevant that a department, Rotor Deconstruction, was born. The company is known for collecting the residues of the ruins and using them in other new projects. In his presentation, Michaël Ghyoot will present the principles of sustainable use of materials that are applied in the projects of Rotor and Rotor Deconstruction. So, Michaël, if you hear us, the screen is yours.
Excellent. Thanks a lot for the introduction and nice to meet you all. I hope you hear me well. I will now share my screen so that you can see my presentation. Normally it should be up and running, hopefully. As said in the introduction, behind the name Rotor, we have actually two different entities. On one hand, there is the non-profit organization, whose logo is this rounded ROTO, turning and turning around. And then a few years ago, we launched Rotor DC, or Rotor Deconstruction, which is mostly active in salvaging and selling reusable building materials. I will speak a little bit more about that in the presentation. For the rest, Rotor, as a non-profit organization, is mostly active in promoting the reuse of building materials through research project assistance to building owners and designers, also a little bit of interior design and different kinds of projects. I will briefly show a few of them in the presentation. But maybe to start with, I would like to bring you back in time, in a period in which reuse was mostly the norm and the most commonplace practice. We can start this history back at the Roman Empire, in which we can find evidences of reuse in the regulations that have survived this period. And at that time, reusing building material was not only a question of opportunism, a way to find materials that were already there and easy to reuse, but it was also a question of symbolism and of cultural attitude, and especially for what concerns public building, the reuse of building elements was a way to preserve the aura of civism that was attached to these buildings, even though the building in itself had to be torn down or demolished. So this is important, maybe those two aspects, the symbolic value, but also the technical value of the materials. I guess it's nothing new, but it is still present nowadays. Even during the 18th century, reusing building material was still quite common. This is an example from Brussels. It's a large urban operation in which they transformed the former palace from the Duke of Brussels, and they replaced it by new buildings at that time. And the way to do that consisted of publishing advertising for the sale of the building materials that were part of these buildings. And so a bit everywhere in the city, you could see this sort of placards advertising the sale of building materials. And we could find back who were the people who bought those materials in such circumstances. And it appears that it was a broad range of different actors, from well-established contractors, building contractors, who found there a way to find materials, to more and smaller craftsmen, and even possibly private clients buying smaller batches of materials. During the 19th century, this practice continued to go on. This is a placard advertising in 2 languages, in French and in Dutch, the sale of a building. And so actually for the public authority, it was a way to organize a sort of competition between demolition contractors, and the one that would offer the best price would be allowed to enter the demolition site and to salvage all the materials. So in other words, the contractors were ready to pay to access the demolition sites because they knew they could make a profit from the sale or the reuse of the building materials. Even in the beginning of the 20th century, we are still in Brussels, the demolition of this beautiful Renaissance palace, as you can see on the picture, is pretty careful. All the materials are well sorted on the site. And if we zoom on the picture, you see there this small placard advertising facade materials for sale, which means that the demolition site was in a way a sort of a salvage yard, a shop where people from the city could buy different batches of materials. And you see there a zoom also on the different materials, the pavers there, all the timber structure, but also the windows that are kept intact. It was really a way of dismantling the building rather than demolishing it, so that the materials could be reused afterwards. And then these practices started to change at around the same period, depends a little bit where and how, but especially in metropolitan area and dense urban areas such as New York City, the question of the price of the land was so important and became so important that the residual value of the materials of the buildings were considered as being negligible in this view. And the need for speed started to be a major factor that hindered the practices of salvaging and reusing building materials, because the contractors were now in a new type of frameworks, in a new type of contracts, in which they would get high penalties if they exceeded the planning of the demolition site, but equally they would get rewards and bonuses if they managed to go faster than expected. And so in this new context, really salvaging building material became something non-profitable anymore. In parallel to the need for speed, it is clear that the mechanization of the works also played a big role, and the development of the hydraulic jackhammers, the bulldozers, the dynamite, all these new technologies that appeared since the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century completely changed the way the works were undertaken. And in this view as well, it was rather a question of efficiency rather than going cautiously so as to enable the reuse of the materials. And a third important factor that goes along with that is the increase of the cost of labor. And at least in Western Europe, it increased constantly and during the whole 20th century, meaning that it wasn't profitable anymore to bring a team of 50 workers on the site for a few weeks to dismantle buildings brick by brick, stone by stone, but rather people tried to minimize the amount of labor involved in the demolition work, but equally on the construction side, of course. And then in the middle of the 20th century, the paradigm was completely different. Demolition had become very destructive. It was now a cost for the building owners. They paid contractors to demolish the building and to evacuate all the rubble. And equally, the buildings were not longer seen as a reservoir of potentially reusable resources, but rather as a potential heap of waste needed to be extracted. And so in this context, reuse of building material started to become something much more marginal, much less common, of course, it was still present in, I would say, a domestic economy. So private client exchanging batches of material was and still is a quite common practice. And nowadays it happens on web platforms such as eBay or Craigslist or Facebook, that sort of exchange websites. But for the professional sector, for the mainstream construction industry, reuse is really an exception rather than a rule. Maybe you can still find it in very specific type of design, interior design, in which people want to evoke a sort of antique materials, old-fashioned building materials, and there you can still find a bit of reuse. Also in the renovation of listed building, you can still find a bit of reuse, but in most of the practices, it's not really up to date anymore. So that's basically the state of the situation when we started to investigate reuse like 10 years or 15 years ago. It has changed since then, especially in the public policies. There is a will to revive reuse practices and to re-implement this practice, both as a way to better manage the resources and avoid creating waste by demolishing buildings and discarding building materials, but also as a way to diminish the environmental impact of producing new materials, because of course reusing existing materials prevents the need to produce new materials and prevents the impacts that arise from this production. And so for us, an important project for Rotorua, an important project was what we called the Opalis project, which was in fact an ongoing process that we started in 2011. We still continue working on this project, and basically it consists of documenting all the companies that are active in the reclamation and the sale of reusable building materials. So we started around Brussels, and you see that in Brussels itself at that time there was no reclamation or salvage dealer, but quite a lot of them were located around the city where the land is cheaper, and they had a sort of organic connection with the city, because most of the materials come from the city, and most of the clients are located in the city. And progressively we started to expand the range and the scope of these visits. These last 3 years we benefited from a European funding that allowed us to expand the territory to cover France and the Netherlands as well. You see the density of those companies, although most of them are small or even micro companies, but there are quite a few of them in Northwest Europe. And we did that in parallel with a partner from the UK, Salvo, who does the same for the UK, basically on Salvo Web. So this is the homepage of Opalis. So basically, in a sense, Opalis is a website which is a directory of dealers. It's not a marketplace. It's not possible to buy materials from Opalis, but it's a good way to connect people in search of material with people selling materials. The methodology for feeding this website is quite time-consuming, because we visit most of these companies and we try to learn more specifically what type of materials those companies deal with, and what kind of services do they provide, and what are the challenges, etc., etc. So you can find all of that on the directory of Opalis. And since this is an example of a sheet documenting one dealer with a few pictures, a few examples. But since 2011, we also developed a more documentary part of Opalis, on which we document commonly reclaimed and reused materials, but also presenting a few inspiring projects demonstrating that reuse is a possible strategy and that can bring interesting results. And there is also a lot of documentation, notably for what concerns the integration of reuse strategies as part of public tenders and tendering procedures. And so Opalis for us was also an important project, because it demonstrated to us that even though some materials were already well taken in charge by the existing dealers, other materials were not, and more specifically, quite modern materials coming from more contemporary projects, maybe more urban projects, tertiary sector buildings. All these materials, although possibly reusable, were not reused. They were discarded off as waste in the main waste stream, demolition waste stream in Brussels. And so that triggered the will to launch rotor deconstruction. So it was like in 2016, and we moved to a place in Brussels, a former chocolate factory, in which we are still located for the moment, but we plan to move this summer. So it was a temporary location. You see there the outdoor yard. We also have this warehouse in which we can store quite a lot of materials, and we have a part of this huge box there, which serves as a showroom for the materials. So you see there a few views from the yard, all the materials that can be kept outside are stored there. You see there the interior of the warehouse, obviously in Brussels and as close to the city center as we are. Each square meter counts, so it's quite dense, meaning quite a lot of logistics to operate that properly. And then here you see a few pictures of the shop where people can come and buy materials. We also have a web shop, which is the web vitrine of what we have in stock for the moment, which also allows customers to buy materials online. You see there a screenshot from the website. Obviously, a big part of the work consists of documenting the materials we have in stock. Things such as the dimensions, the exact state, good pictures of the materials. This is really important to foster the demand for such materials. And so it's an important part of what we do. You see there a few pictures of how we procure the materials. There are different ways. Sometimes we go ourselves with our own teams on site to make the dismantling ourselves. Other time we trade directly with other contractors or even other reclamation dealers to exchange batches of materials. And since a few years, we launched a deposit scheme. So it means that people, professional and private client alike, can bring materials at our facilities, and we take care of the sale of these materials, and if necessary, the conditioning of these materials. And then we we split the profits of the sale, meaning that there is an incentive for the contractors to bring materials at our place. And so basically most of the work we do, it's quite a lot of manual labor, cleaning the materials, cutting them to dimensions, conditioning them, packaging them, documenting them. But then there is also a lot of the job, a lot of the work that consists of, as I said, documenting, but also the sale of the materials. You don't really buy materials as you would buy a pair of new sneakers. So it takes a bit of time, and we do provide a lot of advice to the buyers. And then these different experiences, we also try to foster them in ongoing projects, and rather with the role of a consultant, of an expert, if you want, assisting building owners and designers in integrating building materials. And this allows us to identify a few barriers and a few challenges coming with this idea of reusing building material. So a good project to illustrate that is the renovation of the Zinneke headquarters. So Zinneke is a non-profit organization based in Brussels, active in the social and artistic sector, and they got the opportunity to renovate, to rehabilitate quite a complex set of buildings in the city center of Brussels, thanks to a European funding, which allowed them to carry on all the works and all the projects. And in this project, one of the ambition was to be a sort of pilot project, inspiring project in terms of reusing building materials. And since their funding was public money, they had to follow the public procurement regulation. And so, in a way, the objective became fostering reuse in this context of public tenders. And we assisted them in doing so. So you see there a section of the building there at the back of the parcel, quite an old building which was used to print stamps, fiscal stamps back in the days. And I will just focus on one of the operations in this project, which was the idea of reusing windows for a back facade of one of those street buildings. One of them had to be slightly extended, and so a new facade was to be built. And we wanted to reuse windows for this part of the works. And so we knew that there was a market for that. We knew a few dealers, thanks to the Opalis visits, we knew a few dealers active in or completely specialized in second-hand windows. This is an example of the website of one of these dealers. But at the time of the building permit, we had no idea of the exact dimensions of the windows. We hadn't bought them yet. So what we did is summing up all the requirements in terms of urban regulation, in terms of fire resistance, in terms of the light, the surface of the light, etc., etc. And so we ended up with this drawing depicting the minimal and the maximal surface of the windows. And we told to the urban authorities the windows will be somewhere in between those two limits. And happily, they gave the green light, possibly because it was a back facade that nobody else would see, so it wasn't that important. I imagine it wouldn't work that well with a facade on the street, but it wasn't the case there. And so equally, we had to define the specifications. And for some aspects, it was very important to be very precise. For instance, in terms of energy performances, we needed a minimal performance, and that was not negotiable. But for other aspects, we were a little bit more open. For instance, the color of the frames wasn't that important, or even the composition of the frame. It could be wood, it could be aluminium. It didn't mind a lot. And then we had to procure the works as well, and so explaining the contractors that they would have to install windows that were still to be bought and which needed to be from the second-hand market. And a few weeks before the start of the works on that facade, we made a check and we collected all the windows that were available at that time that met our requirements in terms of dimensions and in terms of performances. And so, to our surprise, there were more candidates than expected. To be honest, I would already have been very happy if we found one element for each bay, but there were more than one option. And so it allowed the architects to really start a sort of a compositioning process, trying to find the most relevant facade, not only for the objective performances, but also from an aesthetical point of view. And one of the interesting things is that among all the possibilities, there was this rounded window, which was part of the collection. I'm almost certain that the architect wouldn't have drawn that spontaneously, but since it was in the selection, it triggered something with them, and they start playing with it. In the end, they used it upside down. This is the work in progress, and then you see there the facade almost finished. The fact that it was a wooden structure also helped a great deal, because it allowed a bit of a flexibility in the dimensions of the bay and that sort of things. It wouldn't have been the same with a concrete structure, for instance. And you see there the finished pictures. And of course, the rounded window here is a sort of a connection with this original rounded windows from the original building, which was preserved as such. In the end, in this project, we also tried to report on the reuse efforts. Most of the efforts were about retaining the existing structure, meaning that in the end, if this is the weight of the original building, we could kept 94% of this original building, only generating very few outflows of materials. And for what concerns the inflow, so the materials we brought to make all the small interventions in the project, 12% of these are reused, which is, as far as we know, quite a good rate for such a project. Of course, the ultimate goal would be to go closer and closer to 100%, but that will probably take a few years' time to make it possible. The last part of the presentation is slightly different. It's about another important aspect when it comes to foster reuse. It's not so much about procedure and administrative strategies. It's more related to the cultural value of reuse and maybe the cliches that are still present when we speak about reuse and how we should deconstruct also these frameworks and these cultural frameworks. And to do that, I will present a few projects in which we were involved as interior designers and in which we tried to find a way somehow to see the value and the beauty in things that were deemed obsolete or that were on the verge of being discarded off as waste because they did not meet anymore a specific set of requirements, etc. One of these projects is the temporary renovation of a museum in Ostend. It's a small coastal city in Belgium. It's an art museum specialized in Belgian modern and contemporary art. And actually, the museum is located in a former shop from the 1940s. It was a beautiful modernist building with those huge windows and those mezzanines, those double height spaces inside. But throughout the years, the users of the building added layers and layers, mostly of placed boards, because they needed more walls to hang the pieces of art. And so somehow the original qualities of the building were a bit lost behind those partition walls. And so basically the project we suggested was about removing a few elements, and instead of evacuating them, we proposed to reuse them inside, but in a slightly different ways. And for instance, we marked the elements that needed to be kept where they were, but also the things that could be removed and things that could be done with what was removed. So you see there, for instance, a cut through this small room to change a little bit the way it is perceived and the way it can be used, but also those partition walls that are displaced in the space, that are kept as intact as possible, but they are simply put somewhere else in the space, so that the scenography changes quite radically, to be honest. And you see there the final result. So there is still a lot of surfaces to hang the pieces of art, but the experience of the visitor is completely different. And we try to find back those beautiful staircases, but also the mezzanines, and offer views on the spaces that were lost before that. So in this case, it was mostly a question of working with the existing and simply trying to renew the way we look and the way we relate to this space by adapting and moving small things here and there, and trying to find the maximal spatial impact with the minimal material impact, if I can say that like that. Another picture of that. And at the same time, we were busy with another project which consisted of renovating a church and converting it into a center for exhibiting arts, contemporary art. And in this case, basically the church was a perfect space in itself. We mostly needed to adapt a little bit the lighting and bring a bit of technical equipment, so electricity, that sort of thing. But the space in itself was perfectly meeting the needs. Although there was one thing missing, it was a small desk, welcome desk, where people could buy tickets, but also a small bookshop, and something that needed to be climatized so that the people working there could be comfortable when waiting for the visitors. And so we tried to do that with the elements coming from the museum, because it was concurrent in terms of timing, and reusing those plasterboards and those MDF boards, medium density fiber boards, for making this desk. And you see there the salvaging on one hand, the transport, and then because those MDF boards were quite imperfect, there were minor scratches and chips here and there, that sort of thing. They weren't perfect, and we knew they wouldn't age perfectly. So we needed to find a way to somehow bring the attention to something else and to hide those small defaults so that we could use those elements. And so we got inspired by a classical architecture and this very volumetric architecture that brings shadows, that brings places of light, places of obscurity, which really helps to deal with those small defaults. And this is the desk we ended up designing with those boards. It's all reclaimed, salvaged MDF boards, and this is the result, which also, of course, plays with the vocabulary of the space in which it is installed, all the while being quite independent from the original space. So it was a kind of a funny process for us to play with those qualities. And you see there the integration in the general space of this church. And so this is almost 100% salvage, no new materials for that. And then a last project which illustrates also this notion of bringing the maximal spatial impact with the minimal material impact. In this case, it was a project for a festival close to Brussels, in which they needed to build temporary stages. And how they did that for the previous editions was to ask different designers to design a project for each year for a new stage. But at that point, they realized that it wasn't very sustainable, in the sense that these stages were to last for about a few weeks, and then they were discarded off as waste and produced quite a lot of spillage and waste resources. And so they wanted something else, and that's why they approached us to reflect upon another strategy. This is the site. It's a former military site in which this festival takes place, and so it also needs a bit of care in the type of design you bring there. It couldn't be a simple warehouse. They wanted something a bit more crafted than that. And this was the location, the exact location on which they wanted this sort of a roofing structure. Basically, the floor was there. It was a former basin which contained a sort of I don't know how you call that, a sort of a big volume in which they stored oil, and the basin all around was a protection in case of a leak, meaning that this basin was exactly the volume of the silo, so that the oil wouldn't enter the soil. But it makes quite a complicated architecture, and they wanted a place to dance and to have scenes and music bands and that sort of thing. And we started work. The first sketches of the design were based on elements, reclaimed elements we had, or we knew where to find them, and things that could be reused. But it soon became clear that we weren't able to manage this project. It was a bit too big for us. There was a lot of questions in terms of structure, fire safety, and so somehow we were reinventing the wheel, and that was a complicated process. So we completely changed the strategy and started to think about existing reusable structure that could be used, such as these tents that are used for public events or family parties or that sort of thing. And that was a possibility But the client was not very happy with this idea because it felt very generic to them. It didn't bring any special or architectural quality, and this was important to them. And so we continued exploring a slightly different road, which was that of the greenhouse, agricultural greenhouses, which are interesting because it's a pretty simple, although not that simple, to be honest, but it's possible to dismantle it and to remount it somewhere else. It's relatively light. It's very efficient in covering a large surface with a minimal material behind it. And so we started investigating for a second-hand greenhouse. In the end, we found one that was for sale in France, a few hundred kilometers from the site. And so we brought a team of volunteers to dismantle those greenhouses structures and rebuild them anew. It's crazy to see the volume of the material compared to the volume it can cover. It's really efficient in this view. And we transport it to Brussels, where it was rebuilt on this site for the festival. Here again, it was a scheme in which there were volunteers involved in the construction process. And you see there the final result, which brings something to the site. The quality of the light through this foil, this plastic foil, is quite good, and it allows for a lot of different configuration. Here it's a lecture, but it was also hosting big parties. And the interesting thing is that this greenhouse is here to stay. So a few weeks ago, there was the new edition of the festival, and they decided to keep the general structure and simply tweak it by changing some things here and there, but basically preserving the existing structure. And possibly it can last for another 10 years, 20 years, if everything goes well. So yeah, thank you a lot for your attention. This was the end of my presentation. I hope I brought something to the general discussion, and I'm now open to questions, if any.
They say we are not muted. Do you hear us? Okay. So thank you very much for your presentation. And I've got a question myself, but also the same question appears on Slido.com. So your projects are very peculiar. They are unique. They are somehow handmade. So you are working like some kind of a boutique. But were you considering on how to expand this experience and way of working, how to make it ubiquitous, how to make it feasible for industries, for private companies, and also for governments or local governments as well?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Thanks for asking it. I would say the answer would depend a little bit on the two different projects. Basically, what we try to do with Rotor DC, so the shop, is to bring second-hand materials to a level of services that is comparable to that of new materials. Meaning that at least for some streams of materials, for instance, tilings, flooring tiles, elements, lighting elements, mostly finishing elements, that's the focus we try to have. We really try to make them as available and as easy to procure as new materials. So that would be one way to answer, that a general contractor can find materials, second-hand materials from our place. And then with Rotor as a non-profit organization, we also tackle this question, but mostly through assistance. We really help building developers and their architects and their engineers to make it possible to integrate reclamation and reuse in their workflow. And most of the time, it doesn't require a lot of changes. It's mostly very specific aspects that needs to be addressed. But if you address them correctly, then it makes it possible to implement reuse even in very large scale projects. For the moment, we are busy with a building owner as part of the redevelopment of a skyscraper in the city center of Brussels. It's really a huge building, like 20,000 square meters, 20 floors. It's a large operation. And we tried to bring this notion of reuse, and in the end, there will be quite a lot of materials that will be reused in this operation. But for the moment, it's true that it still requires a bit of a bespoke approach. It's not something that is that common or that easy to implement, but it's not impossible as well.
Thank you for your answer. I will ask the audience whether there are some. Do you hear us?
Okay now.
Do you hear us? Okay, thank you for the answer. I will ask the audience whether there are some questions. I cannot see any questions, but I still have one more question. Here in this part of Europe, in Baltic states, we have lots of buildings that were built after the Second World War. And you know that the quality of construction technologies and the materials is really poor. So what is your approach towards the selection? What materials can be reused and what cannot? And probably not every brick can be reused for the second time.
Sure, indeed. Not everything is reusable, or at least not everything is easily reusable. And it's true that the 20th century left a sort of embarrassing legacy in terms of the quality of the materials, sometimes the toxicity of some materials. The question of asbestos, for instance, is a major concern, and it really hinders the reuse potential of an element. So yeah, it's not always easy. What we try to foster is the idea of auditing a building prior to any major transformation, or even prior to a demolition, if a demolition is needed, to identify the reuse potential. And the question of the quality of the materials obviously is an important one. Also how they are connected. Sometimes you have potentially reusable materials, but they are connected with a cement-based mortar, for instance, and so this will prevent the reclamation of the bricks or of the flooring tiles or the cladding. And ultimately, it's the question of the demand. Is there a demand for that material? And to this day, the demand is pretty much compared with new products, and this makes also a sort of unfair competition, because the cost of sending someone on site, even if it's just to check if the material is possibly dismountable, it costs more than bringing this material new on your construction site. And so there is a sort of glass ceiling that prevents the reuse of a lot of building materials, because simply the new alternative is just so cheap compared to the cost of labor involved in reusing materials. So these are all systemic barriers that will at some point probably need to be addressed by relevant authorities. Within this border, it's still possible to operate, and reuse can be possible for some materials and not necessarily more expensive. So I guess that would be my answer, but you're totally right saying that not everything is reusable.
Can you hear us now, Michael?
Yes.
Thank you for the answer.